Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The flight to a different fate. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over JFK International Airport. Its light filtered through the tall glass walls of the terminal, illuminating thousands of travelers making their way to unknown destinations. Suitcases rolled noisily across the gleaming floors, and the hum of overhead announcements blended with the chatter of voices, creating a symphony of movement and sound. Among this sea of people was Daniel Wright, a man whose presence turned heads without him even trying. Tall and poised, with an air of quiet confidence, Daniel walked briskly through the terminal. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and polished Oxford shoes, he looked every inch the successful businessman he was. His sleek leather carry-on rolled smoothly beside him, the only luggage he needed for his flight. For Daniel, today was not just another trip. It marked the closing of one of the most significant chapters of his life. Just 3 days ago, he had completed a deal that had the potential to redefine the global aviation industry. His company had successfully acquired Skylink Airways, a failing airline teetering on bankruptcy. The acquisition wasn't just about business, it was personal. Years ago, Daniel had experienced firsthand what it felt like to be underestimated, overlooked, and denied opportunities simply because of how he looked. Now, at the pinnacle of his career, he stood as a symbol of resilience and perseverance. He had taken the insults, the skepticism, and the rejections, and turned them into fuel for his success. Today's flight to London was a chance to celebrate quietly, a chance to breathe after the storm. JFK Terminal Gate C10. Daniel slowed his pace as he approached the gate. His boarding pass, pristine and marked with C2A, business class, rested securely in his hand. He was used to traveling in business class, luxurious enough to relax, but not overindulgent. As he neared the counter, Daniel observed a group of passengers ahead of him. The gate agent, a young woman with short blonde hair and a crisp uniform, greeted each passenger warmly. She smiled widely at a middle-aged white man, shaking his hand as she scanned his ticket and waved him through. Behind him, a young couple was treated with similar friendliness. The woman's cheerful laughter echoed as she walked down the jet bridge. Daniel stepped forward when it was his turn, handing over his boarding pass with a polite smile and a nod. The gate agent took his pass and scanned it. For a moment, her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt that Daniel had seen far too often. She glanced at the screen as if verifying something. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice hesitant but polite. "Yes, that's me," Daniel replied evenly. Her smile returned, but it was smaller now, less genuine. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." Daniel accepted his pass and walked past her toward the jet bridge, but he couldn't ignore the slight discomfort gnawing at him. It was subtle, but noticeable. That pause, that glance, a momentary hesitation that questioned whether he belonged. Stepping onto the aircraft. The scent of cool, conditioned air and faint perfume greeted him as he stepped inside the aircraft. The business class cabin was immaculate. Wide leather seats, neatly folded blankets, and an inviting sense of space. He had flown countless times, but the sight of business class never failed to make him appreciate how far he'd come. Daniel placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled into seat C2A, the aisle seat. He adjusted his cufflinks, pulled out his tablet, and began organizing his notes for the meeting awaiting him in London. Skylink Airways might now belong to him, but much work lay ahead to turn the struggling airline into an empire. As he glanced around the cabin, he noticed a few other business-class passengers beginning to take their seats. A man in his mid-40s, with a thick mustache and wearing a designer blazer, took the seat across from Daniel. He gave Daniel a brief glance but said nothing. Behind him, a group of 3 men, clearly business colleagues, laughed loudly as they stored their bags and settled into their seats. A few moments later, a flight attendant entered the cabin. She was tall, with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform impeccably pressed. Her demeanor exuded authority as she moved swiftly through the cabin, ensuring everything was in order. Daniel nodded politely when she passed his seat, but she didn't acknowledge him. "Excuse me, miss," said the mustached man across from Daniel, waving the attendant over. "Can I get a glass of water before takeoff?" "Certainly, sir," the flight attendant replied with a bright smile. She disappeared briefly and returned moments later with a chilled glass of water, setting it on the man's tray table. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet patience. He had always noticed how small gestures often revealed larger truths about perception and privilege. The incident. Just as Daniel began to relax, reviewing his tablet's contents, another flight attendant entered the cabin. This one, a petite woman with short black hair and an apologetic expression, approached Daniel's seat. She cleared her throat softly, drawing his attention. "Sir," she said, her voice low, "may I see your boarding pass?" Daniel looked up, momentarily confused. "Of course," he replied, pulling the pass from his jacket pocket and handing it to her. She scanned the pass quickly, her brows furrowing. Sir, it seems this seat is reserved for business class passengers. Are you sure you're in the correct seat?" The statement, though phrased politely, landed like a punch to the gut. Daniel's expression remained calm, but inside, a familiar anger burned. He glanced around the cabin and noticed several passengers looking toward him, their curiosity piqued. "I'm quite sure," Daniel said, his voice measured and firm. "That is my boarding pass, and this is my assigned seat, C2A. The flight attendant hesitated. "I see, sir. Let me just check with the gate agent quickly." Before Daniel could respond, she turned and walked briskly back toward the front of the plane. The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. The mustached man across from Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Minutes later, the gate agent appeared in the cabin, accompanied by the flight attendant. Her demeanor had shifted from professional to slightly flustered. She carried a small tablet in her hands. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice louder than necessary. "We're just having a bit of confusion here about your seat assignment. Are you sure you were booked in business class?" Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. The quiet whispers of the other passengers felt deafening now. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved a second document, and handed it over. "This is my booking confirmation," he said evenly. The gate agent studied the document, her cheeks reddening slightly as realization dawned. "Oh, I see. My apologies, Mr. Wright. There must have been a misunderstanding." Daniel took the papers back and leaned back into his seat. "Misunderstandings happen," he said quietly, though his calm exterior masked the storm inside. The gate agent retreated quickly, and the flight attendant offered an insincere smile. "Thank you for your understanding, sir. Enjoy your flight." Resilience and reflection. As the cabin returned to normal, Daniel's gaze fell to the window. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, streaking the sky with shades of pink and orange. For a moment, he let himself breathe, releasing the tension. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today was different. Today, Daniel knew something that the flight attendants, the gate agent, and the other passengers did not. They had questioned whether he belonged in business class, but soon they would realize something far greater. He didn't just belong, he owned the airline. With that thought, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. This was just the beginning, a truth waiting to be told. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the final boarding announcements echoed faintly in the background. The sunlight outside had dimmed to a twilight glow, casting an almost surreal calm over the aircraft. Passengers in business class settled into their seats, scrolling through their phones or adjusting their recliners, but the air still buzzed with unspoken tension, a ripple caused by Daniel Wright's earlier interaction with the gate agent and flight attendant. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his face an impassive mask, Though his mind wandered to the incident moments before, it wasn't anger that coursed through him now. It was something sharper, something quieter, resolve. This was nothing new. He dealt with perceptions, assumptions, and outright biases his entire life. But today, there was an irony he could not ignore. The very airline that had questioned his presence now belonged to him. As the aircraft doors finally closed, Daniel opened his tablet and clicked into the digital presentation his assistant had prepared for the upcoming meeting in London. This was more than just another business acquisition. It was a turning point. The purchase of Skylink Airways was personal, and he intended to make sure the airline's culture shifted along with its ownership. Memories of the journey. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Daniel's mind wandered back to where his journey had begun, a small neighborhood in Baltimore, where the sounds of sirens and shouting were as much a part of life as the laughter of children playing in the narrow streets. His mother, Lorraine Wright, had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Daniel remembered her vividly, a woman of fierce determination, with calloused hands and a warm smile that never wavered, no matter how hard life pressed down on her. She used to tell him stories before bed, tales of heroes who rose from nothing, of kings and leaders who overcame impossible odds. "You can be anything, Danny," she would whisper, brushing a hand over his forehead. "The world won't always see you for who you are, but don't let that stop you. Be undeniable." And so he had. He worked his way through school with the same unrelenting drive his mother had shown, earning scholarships, acing exams, and taking part-time jobs to survive. He wasn't handed opportunities, he created them. By the time he graduated from Harvard with a degree in economics, Daniel had become someone impossible to ignore. The flight's atmosphere shifts. A loud thud jolted Daniel out of his thoughts as the landing gear retracted and the airplane began its climb into the night sky. The cabin darkened, leaving only the faint glow of reading lights dotting the space like small stars. The flight attendant with auburn hair returned to the business class section, carrying a tray of drinks. Her eyes lingered on Daniel briefly before she offered a thin smile. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked, the words clipped but polite. "Just water, please," Daniel said, meeting her gaze with an unwavering calm. As she moved on to the next passenger, Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle in again. He could sense the subtle glances from others in the cabin, the unspoken question that hung in the air. Who is this man, really? Across the aisle, the mustached businessman cleared his throat, looking directly at Daniel now for the first time. "Excuse me," the man began. "I couldn't help but notice earlier. Seemed like there was a bit of confusion about your seat." His tone was polite, but his curiosity was obvious. Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It happens sometimes," he replied simply. The man nodded awkwardly, unsure how to continue, and turned his attention back to his in-flight magazine. Daniel leaned back in his seat, but inside, a flicker of something rose. Anticipation. They didn't know yet. Soon they would. The unseen forces behind the flight. What none of these passengers knew, what even the flight crew didn't yet understand, was how much work Daniel had put into reaching this moment. Acquiring Skylink Airways had not been a simple financial transaction. For months, Daniel and his team had worked tirelessly, negotiating with stakeholders, restructuring finances, and developing a bold plan to revive an airline that most analysts had written off as a lost cause. Skylink was more than a company to Daniel. It was a symbol of his personal journey, a chance to create a legacy that would outlive him. He'd always believed that representation matters, and for decades, the aviation industry had remained a reflection of deeply rooted barriers. Few people of color held leadership roles, and systemic biases often excluded them from opportunities altogether. By owning and leading an airline, Daniel wasn't just changing his own life. He was challenging an industry to rethink what leadership looks like. And today, as the engines hummed and the flight crew moved efficiently through their duties, Daniel knew he was on the cusp of something profound. A small encounter. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Dinner had been served, glasses clinked, and overhead lights dimmed. Most passengers dozed off or scrolled through their entertainment screens. Daniel remained awake, deep in thought, when he noticed a soft presence beside him. He looked up to see the petite flight attendant, the one who had questioned his boarding pass earlier, standing next to his seat. Her expression was more reserved now, a mixture of apology and discomfort. "Sir, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about earlier," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the engines. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Sorry for what?" She hesitated. "The confusion with your seat. It wasn't intentional. I just—" Daniel held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's fine," he said firmly, though his tone was kind. "It happens." The woman looked relieved but still uneasy, as though she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Finally, she nodded and walked away, leaving Daniel with his thoughts. He had accepted the apology, but he couldn't help wondering how she, and everyone else, would react when they learned the truth. He wasn't here to embarrass anyone or seek revenge. That wasn't who he was. But he also wasn't going to hide what he had accomplished. A legacy in the making. Hours later, as the plane flew steadily across the darkened Atlantic sky, Daniel's eyes drifted to his tablet again. On the screen was an internal memo scheduled to go out to all Skylink Airways employees upon his arrival in London. The headline read, "Welcome our new CEO, Daniel Wright, visionary leader in aviation." The memo outlined Daniel's history, his vision for the company, and his plans for turning Skylink Airways into a thriving, modern airline that prioritized diversity, innovation, and world-class service. The memo would also reveal that Skylink was no longer a sinking ship, but a vessel with purpose and direction, a reflection of Daniel himself. Daniel stared at the headline, a quiet pride filling his chest. He imagined the reactions, the surprise, the admiration, and perhaps, for some, the discomfort. He wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. He was here to show what was possible. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hours ago, they had questioned whether he belonged in business class. Soon, they would know. He owned the very airline they were flying on. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines lull him into a rare moment of peace. This flight was more than a journey across the ocean. It was a journey to his future, a future where no one could deny his place, his worth, or his legacy. The quiet before the revelation. The cabin had sunk into a serene hush as the aircraft soared high above the Atlantic Ocean, its wings slicing through the darkness like a silent predator. The hum of the engines acted like a lullaby for most of the passengers, many of whom had reclined their seats to steal a few hours of sleep. The lights in the business class section were dimmed, save for a few glowing screens and the occasional reading light. Daniel Wright, however, remained awake. His seat was reclined slightly, but his mind refused to rest. He scrolled absently through the latest financial reports on his tablet, though his focus was drifting elsewhere. The incident earlier, though minor on the surface, had stirred old memories he had long buried under his success. It wasn't anger that lingered, it was something more poignant, like a whispered reminder of where he had started and why he had worked so hard to get where he was. He looked around the cabin once more. The mustached businessman across the aisle was snoring quietly, his magazine resting on his lap. A younger man in glasses was fast asleep 2 rows ahead, headphones still perched on his ears. Behind him, the group of 3 colleagues had finally quieted down, their boisterous laughter replaced with deep slumber. The flight attendants had disappeared into the galley, likely enjoying a much-needed reprieve now that the passengers were settled. For the first time in hours, the plane seemed suspended in stillness, a temporary escape from the chaos of life on the ground. Reflections in the dark. Daniel tilted his head against the headrest and closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to drift. His thoughts meandered back to his childhood home in Baltimore, a place where success stories were few and far between. The house was small and drafty, tucked between two crumbling buildings on a street where dreams were often stifled before they could take root. Daniel's mother, Lorraine Wright, had worked tirelessly to keep their world intact, pulling double shifts as a nurse and picking up odd jobs on the weekends. She'd saved every penny to make sure Daniel could attend a decent school, always telling him that education was his ticket out. "I don't care how hard you have to work," she'd say, her voice full of quiet authority. "You'll show them, Danny, you'll show them all." It was a mantra he had carried into adulthood. Those words had been the fire in his veins during long nights of studying, during unpaid internships where he had to prove himself 10 times over, and during board meetings where he was often the only black man in the room. He had endured the stares, the patronizing comments, the silent doubts that said, "You don't belong here." Yet here he was, owning a company that no one thought could be saved, owning Skylink Airways, the very airline that once might not have let him pass the gate. A discreet conversation. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of feet. He opened his eyes to see the auburn-haired flight attendant walking slowly through the cabin, checking on passengers. As she passed, she glanced toward Daniel's seat, hesitated, and then turned back. "Excuse me, Mr. Wright," she said in a low voice, leaning in slightly. Her tone was professional, but there was something else there, curiosity, perhaps. "Is there anything I can get you before you rest?" Daniel offered her a faint smile. "No, I'm fine, thank you." She lingered a moment longer, her eyes studying him with an unreadable expression. Finally, she nodded and moved on. Daniel watched her disappear into the galley, wondering if the earlier confusion still weighed on her. Perhaps she sensed something different about him, something she couldn't quite place. His smile widened slightly. Soon enough, they would all know. The ripple effect. As the hours passed, Daniel found himself growing restless. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, stretching his legs. The plane was still cloaked in darkness, and most passengers remained oblivious to his movements. He quietly made his way to the small galley at the front of the business class section, where two flight attendants were whispering softly to one another. The younger of the two, the petite woman who had initially questioned his seat, froze when she saw him. Her face flushed as if she remembered their earlier interaction. The older flight attendant, taller, with a streak of grey in her hair, gave Daniel a polite nod. "Could I trouble you for some water?" Daniel asked softly. "Of course, sir," the older woman replied quickly, reaching for a bottle and handing it to him. The younger flight attendant opened her mouth as if to speak, but her words faltered. Daniel noticed, offering her an encouraging smile. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. She exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping. I just wanted to apologize again for earlier. It wasn't my intention to, well, make you feel uncomfortable." Daniel studied her for a moment. She was young, likely newer to the job, and he could see the discomfort in her posture. It was a familiar look, the kind people wore when they realized they had misjudged someone. "It's all right," Daniel said quietly. "We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is what we learn from them." She nodded, clearly relieved, and Daniel returned to his seat, leaving her with those words lingering in the air. The unseen power. Back in his seat, Daniel placed the water on his tray table and opened his tablet once more. A few clicks brought him to the latest employee roster for Skylink Airways. As the new CEO, he'd spent hours studying the staff, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and office personnel, trying to understand the human side of the struggling airline. He saw names, faces, stories. What he didn't see were the individuals like himself, those who had once been told they didn't belong, those who had been underestimated or overlooked. That was something Daniel intended to change. His first internal memo, scheduled to be released the moment his plane touched down in London, outlined not just his leadership philosophy, but a vision for the airline's future. A commitment to diversity and inclusivity across all levels of the company. opportunities for young professionals from underserved communities to join the airline industry. Programs to nurture future leaders, ensuring the company reflected the world it served. This wasn't just about profits and shareholder value. It was about impact, about creating opportunities for the next Daniel Wrights of the world. The revelation approaches. As the first hints of dawn broke on the horizon, the flight crew began their preparations for landing. The cabin lights flickered on, and passengers stirred awake, blinking in the soft glow. Daniel packed his tablet away and adjusted his jacket, his mind already turning to the day ahead. The mustached businessman across the aisle glanced at Daniel as he retrieved his carry-on from the overhead bin. This time, the look was different, curious, almost respectful, as if he, too, sensed something he couldn't quite explain. The flight attendant with auburn hair returned to Daniel's seat as the plane descended. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Wright," she said softly, her tone more genuine than before. Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you. It's been a smooth flight." As the plane touched down in London, Daniel's heart beat a little faster. Outside, the city skyline stretched beneath the orange glow of dawn. The passengers had no idea that the man sitting among them, the one who had been questioned about his seat, was about to step into a meeting that would alter the airline's history forever. Soon, they would know the truth. He didn't just belong here, he led here. The power of truth. The soft thud of the plane's wheels striking the runway echoed through the cabin, jostling the passengers awake. The early morning sun spilled over the tarmac of Heathrow Airport, spreading streaks of amber and gold across the horizon. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, there was an air of quiet relief, another long-haul flight completed. Daniel Wright sat perfectly still in seat C2A, his face serene, but his mind was already moving at lightning speed. Today was not just another arrival in London. Today was the beginning of his work to reshape the very industry that had too often ignored people like him. Owning Skyling Airways was more than just a business acquisition. It was a statement, one built on years of resilience, sacrifice, and vision. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off, and almost immediately, the cabin burst into quiet chaos. Passengers rose from their seats, retrieving bags and stretching their legs, while the flight crew bustled about offering departing pleasantries. Daniel remained seated, observing the scene with calm precision. His presence didn't go unnoticed. The petite flight attendant, the one who had earlier questioned his seat, glanced toward him nervously as she helped passengers in the aisle. A conversation that changes everything. Just as Daniel reached for his leather carry-on, the mustached businessman from across the aisle stepped into the aisle and looked at him again. His brows furrowed slightly, as if he were piecing together a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice polite but curious. "I couldn't help but feel I've seen you somewhere before. You're not a celebrity or anything, are you?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Not a celebrity, no," he replied with a small smile. The man squinted for a moment, then extended his hand. "Well, either way, it's a pleasure sharing a flight with you. My name's Robert Givens. I'm in logistics. I travel a lot, so I suppose we're all used to running into interesting people." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Daniel Wright. Good to meet you, Robert." As they exchanged pleasantries, the auburn-haired flight attendant from earlier moved toward Daniel's seat, stopping politely at the edge of his row. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice soft and careful now, "it's been a pleasure having you on board. I hope you had a comfortable flight." Daniel nodded. "It was excellent, thank you." She smiled faintly but lingered for just a moment longer, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she stepped away, returning to assist other passengers. Daniel noticed Robert watching the exchange closely, his curiosity clearly piqued. Right. Robert murmured to himself as he walked away toward the front of the cabin. Daniel didn't pay him much attention, though. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to put together the pieces. The arrival at Heathrow. Daniel stepped off the plane into the bright, bustling corridors of Heathrow Airport. He adjusted his tie, pulled his sleek leather carry-on behind him, and walked with purpose through the terminal. London had always been one of his favorite cities, a place where the old world met the new. But today, the city represented something much more profound, the launchpad for his new vision. A private driver awaited him near the terminal exit, holding a sign that read Mr. Daniel Wright in neat handwriting. The chauffeur, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, greeted Daniel with a respectful nod and opened the back door of the luxury black sedan waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away from Heathrow, Daniel pulled out his phone to check his messages. His assistant, Margaret, had already sent him a summary of his schedule for the day. A press conference was set for noon at Skylink's London headquarters, where he would be formally introduced as the new CEO and majority owner of the airline. Executives, media outlets, and employees from across the company would be there. The weight of legacy. As the car weaved through London's streets, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Owning an airline had never been part of his original dream. He had started in finance, climbing the ladder through mergers, investments, and leadership roles. But the deeper he ventured into the business world, the more he saw how industries like aviation remained unchanged, elitist, exclusionary, and resistant to fresh perspectives. It wasn't just about being a black man in a predominantly white, male industry, it was about being overlooked. He remembered one particular incident years ago when he was denied an upgrade on a flight, despite holding a fully eligible ticket. The attendant's polite but clipped words still echoed in his memory. "I'm sorry, sir, but this area is reserved for our business class customers." Daniel had taken that slight and filed it away, not with bitterness, but with determination. Someday, he had told himself quietly that day, "I'll own the plane they don't want me to sit on." Today, that quiet promise had become reality. The headquarters of Skylink Airways. The black sedan pulled into the circular driveway of Skylink Airways' London headquarters, a sleek glass structure that gleamed in the morning light. Dozens of employees and journalists already milled around outside, their attention drawn to the arrival of the new CEO. Cameras flashed as Daniel stepped out of the car, his tall frame and confident stride immediately commanding attention. Margaret, his assistant, met him at the entrance, a stack of files tucked under her arm and her headset in place. "Good morning, Mr. Wright," she said briskly, walking alongside him as they entered the building. "The press conference is set up in the atrium. Everyone's waiting." "And the employee memo?" Daniel asked, referring to the internal announcement about his ownership. "Sent this morning. Reactions have already started coming in, mostly shock, some excitement, and a few concerns from senior staff." Daniel smiled. "As expected. Let's go meet them." The revelation. The atrium of Skylink's headquarters was a sprawling space with towering glass walls and an open floor plan. Rows of chairs had been set up for the media, while Skylink employees lined the balconies of the floors above, peering down to witness the historic moment. A podium stood at the center, flanked by the airline's logo. When Daniel stepped into the room, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him, some curious, some skeptical, but all attentive. Cameras snapped, and whispers rippled through the audience as he approached the podium. "Good morning," Daniel began, his voice clear and steady. "I'm Daniel Wright, and as of today, I am the new CEO and majority owner of Skylink Airways." The room froze. Daniel paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. From the corner of his eye, he could see the auburn-haired flight attendant and the gate agent, the very people who had doubted his presence in business class, standing near the back of the room, their faces pale with shock. "I know many of you are surprised," Daniel continued, his tone warm but firm. "But I want you to understand something. Skylink is no longer just another airline. It is a symbol of change, innovation, and opportunity. We will build a company where everyone, regardless of where they come from, will have a chance to rise." His words rang through the atrium, powerful and deliberate. Around him, reactions varied: stunned silence, murmurs of surprise, and nods of quiet approval. Daniel looked out across the crowd, his gaze steady. For years, people had questioned his place. Today, they had their answer: a new horizon. The atrium buzzed with whispers, the weight of Daniel Wright's words still lingering in the air like an echo. It was not every day that an announcement rippled through a room with such force, especially one that challenged assumptions, broke barriers, and shattered expectations. Standing tall at the podium, Daniel felt the collective gaze of the audience settle on him: the staff, the media, the skeptics, and the believers. This moment had been years in the making, and now, under the golden morning light streaming through the atrium's glass walls, it had arrived. The silence broke into applause, first tentative, then swelling like a wave. It wasn't unanimous. Some clapped out of politeness, others out of genuine respect, and a few held back, their expressions clouded with confusion or resistance. That was expected. Change always met resistance. Daniel smiled faintly, stepping back from the podium to allow his words to settle in the hearts and minds of those before him. For now, he had planted the seed. The work that lay ahead would water it, nurture it, and prove that his vision for Skylink Airways wasn't just rhetoric, it was a revolution. Private conversations and new allies. After the conference ended, Daniel stepped off the stage and was immediately met by Margaret, his efficient assistant, clipboard in hand. "Well done," she said, flashing a rare smile. "The press is eating this up. Social media is already flooded with the announcement: new CEO shakes up aviation industry." Daniel chuckled softly. "Let's see what they're saying by the end of the week. Change isn't overnight." Margaret nodded, her focus shifting to a line of senior executives approaching them. Some were familiar faces from Skylink's leadership team. Others were outsiders, likely allies from Daniel's team or investors. Each of them had a different expression, some measured, some eager, and others downright skeptical. The first to greet Daniel was James Renfield, Skylink's COO, a tall man in his 50s with neatly combed grey hair and sharp blue eyes. "Mr. Wright," Renfield began, extending a hand, his voice polished but guarded. "Welcome to Skylink Airways. I must admit, your announcement caught many of us by surprise." Daniel shook his hand firmly, reading the unspoken message behind Renfield's words. He'd seen it before. "Who are you to take charge here?" "Change is often surprising, Mr. Renfield," Daniel replied smoothly, meeting his gaze head-on. "But I trust you'll agree. Skylink needed change." Before Renfield could respond, a younger executive, Sophia Patel, Skylink's Director of Customer Relations, stepped forward. Her smile was warm and genuine. "Mr. Wright, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your speech was inspiring. I think many of us have been waiting for someone to bring a new vision to this company." Daniel smiled, shaking her hand. "Thank you, Sophia. I look forward to working with you to bring that vision to life." One by one, Daniel greeted the executives, reading their reactions like an open book. Some were eager to embrace his leadership, others wary, but he expected no less. Trust was earned, not given. The uncomfortable conversations. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel noticed two familiar figures lingering near the back of the room: the auburn-haired flight attendant and the gate agent who had questioned his seat the day before. The flight attendant's face was pale, her earlier authority replaced with clear discomfort. Margaret noticed them too. "Should I ask them to leave, sir?" Daniel shook his head. "No, let them stay." Taking a breath, he crossed the room toward them. Their eyes widened as he approached, unsure of what to expect. "Good morning," Daniel said calmly, his tone neutral but kind. "I believe we met on the flight yesterday." The gate agent, her name tag now visible as Sarah Mendez, nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wright. Her voice faltered. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened at the gate." The flight attendant, Rebecca Langley, chimed in softly, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to offend you, sir. Daniel studied them both for a long moment. He could see their discomfort, the guilt in their expressions. But more than that, he saw something else, opportunity. I appreciate your apologies, Daniel said finally. But this isn't about me. It's about something bigger, about how we see people, about how we treat them based on what we assume, rather than what we know. Both women nodded, clearly humbled. Daniel continued, I didn't come here to call anyone out or humiliate them. I came here to lead. And that means creating a culture where every passenger, every employee, feels respected. That's the kind of airline I intend to build. Rebecca's eyes softened, her guilt shifting to something closer to admiration. Thank you, Mr. Wright. I'll do better. Daniel smiled faintly. That's all I ask. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the two women standing there, changed, perhaps in ways they hadn't expected. Building the vision. Over the next few hours, Daniel held a series of high-stakes meetings with Skylink's leadership team. He laid out his vision for the company, innovation, inclusivity, and excellence, in no uncertain terms. He spoke of transforming Skylink into a modern, customer-focused airline that not only competed, but led in a cutthroat industry. He introduced initiatives for leadership development programs for underrepresented communities, partnerships with aviation schools to train a diverse generation of pilots and engineers, a renewed focus on customer experience, ensuring every passenger felt valued, whether they sat in economy, business, or first class. There were challenges, of course. Skeptics questioned his ideas, while traditionalists resisted change. But Daniel stood firm. He had not come this far to bow to resistance. A legacy in motion. By the time the day ended, Daniel stood by his office window, watching the sun sink low over the London skyline. He sipped a glass of water, feeling the weight of what lay ahead, but also the satisfaction of what he had set in motion. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. Lorraine Wright. I saw the news. So proud of you, Danny. I knew you'd show them. Daniel smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. He typed back, Daniel, thanks, Mom. We're just getting started. The plane ride home. Days later, Daniel boarded another Skylink Airways flight, his airline. This time, the gate agent greeted him with genuine warmth, and the flight attendants smiled without hesitation. As he settled into his business class seat, he noticed something different. No whispers, no stares, just respect. As the plane climbed into the sky, Daniel gazed out the window at the clouds, stretching far into the horizon. The journey had been long and grueling, but he had arrived. And now, he wasn't just a passenger on this flight, he owned the sky.